Hello, so now I'm going to be talking about chapter 5, which picks up immediately from chapter 4. Nick has returned home after his long day that started in chapter 4 with lunch with Gatsby over in Manhattan and then tea and the rest of his date with Jordan Baker. He gets home and he realizes that his house is not on fire, but rather that Gatsby's house is all lit up. Gatsby's outside looking around. This whole, pretty ambitious for 2 o'clock in the morning, and approaches Nick and says, "Hey, you want to go to Coney Island?" And Nick's like, "No, that doesn't sound like a great idea." And then Gatsby says, "Oh, well, maybe we could go swimming. I really haven't used my pool all summer long." And Nick's like, "No, I think I need to go to bed." And then Nick astutely realizes that Gatsby's probably all jacked up because he is curious to know if Nick has accepted his offer to work it out so that Daisy can come over to his house. And so Nick assures him that he'll call Daisy the next day. And then an awkward conversation ensues where Gatsby talks about how he's got to get his yard cut, and he doesn't mean his own, he means Nick's yard. And then to add a little bit more awkwardness to the conversation, Gatsby inquires about Nick's sort of work status and his financial status and says, "Listen, if you'd ever like to take a job on the side," and normally this is something that would be pretty offensive to Nick, but Nick realizes that because he's doing Gatsby a favor, Gatsby just feels obligated to give him sort of tit for tat situation. And Nick's like, "Don't worry about it, dude. I don't need it. I'm not interested in that." And so Nick sets everything up and the date is set. And I want you to pay attention to what Fitzgerald is doing now in this chapter with the weather. The day arrives that Daisy's gonna come over for tea at Nick's house, and it's pouring down rain. And even though Nick has gone above and beyond what needs to be done for his home, Gatsby's just got to do everything over the top, and he brings in basically a greenhouse. I want you to also pay attention to what Gatsby is wearing. Again, color is so important. And Daisy is to arrive at 4 p.m. and Gatsby is just a ball of nerves, and he announces that he's gonna leave because, as he says, nobody's coming to tea. It's too late and he can't wait all day, even though it's actually a few minutes before Daisy is supposed to arrive. So Nick, who's orchestrated all of this on Gatsby's behalf, is kind of trying to get him to stay, and sure enough, right at that moment, the sound of Daisy's horn is honking as she has arrived. So Nick goes out to greet her, and she teasingly questions, Nick's rationale for inviting her over. And through that conversation, while she's speaking, Nick says he calls her voice a wild tonic in the rain. So the sort of magical and enchanting quality of her voice is brought up again. And so they go inside, and no one is more surprised than Nick to find his own home empty. So as, yet one more pile up of awkward situations, as he's sort of exclaiming in surprise, there's a knock on the door, and of course, it's Gatsby, who has literally run out the back door in the rain and around Nick's house to be all cash and "Hey, what's up?" So he walks in, and I like this scene because it demonstrates Gatsby's vulnerability. He might be super rich, but he doesn't want just any woman, he wants Daisy. And this is a high stakes situation here, and he is going all out, and so he has a lot to lose, and that helps Fitzgerald ingratiate the character of Gatsby to readers. We feel sympathy for him, we're gonna root for him, and we want him to succeed because he is so desperately trying to succeed here. And once the two of them are reunited, the air is a bit tense. And I want to read to you that part. Nick says, "There was a pause. It endured horribly. I had nothing to do in the hall, so I went into the room. Gatsby, his hands still in his pockets, was reclining against the mantelpiece in a strained counterfeit of perfect ease, even of boredom. His head leaned back so far that it rested against the face of a defunct mantelpiece clock, and from this position his distraught eyes stared down at Daisy, who was sitting frightened but graceful on the edge of a stiff chair. "We've met before," muttered Gatsby. His eyes glanced momentarily at me, and his lips parted with an abortive attempt at a laugh. Luckily, the clock took this moment to tilt dangerously at the pressure of his head, whereupon he turned and caught it with trembling fingers and set it back in place. Then he sat down rigidly, his elbow on the arm of the sofa and his chin in his hand. "I'm sorry about the clock," he said. My own face now assumed a deep, tropical burn, but I couldn't muster a single commonplace out of the 1,000 in my head. "It's an old clock," I told them idiotically. I think we all believed for a moment that it had smashed in pieces on the floor. Now, what seems to be could be, again, a throwaway sort of scene, is you have to understand an author is doing exactly what a prop designer or anybody who's creating set pieces is doing. Those things do not appear by accident. He wrote that in there. He wrote this whole scene, and it's not just any decorative item in the home, it is a clock. And it's not just any kind of clock, it's a broken clock. So the fact that Gatsby has spent so much time thinking about Daisy, and there has been so much time since they've been apart and so much has happened in the in-between, there's no one in the novel, and I think with maybe the exception of Romeo and Juliet, there's no other character in literature who wants to turn back time, to put that back the way that it was before. So that's why that scene has such significance, and it's so worth discussing because everything sort of is against the clock, and just people aren't on time, and that's something that you'll see in a later chapter too when we get an explanation through a flashback. Nick, being the thoughtful one that he is, decides to leave the two alone, and he goes outside so that he can let them reorient themselves with each other. And when he's outside, he observes Gatsby's house and recounts its history. Despite the fact that it looks like it's from the old world, old European, neoclassical design, it was only built just the decade before. And further, the guy who built the home tried to bribe his neighbors by offering to pay 5 years worth of their taxes if they would thatch their roofs, which is to put straw on it to make it look like they were presents, and that way he could be the lord looking over the land and his domain. Didn't go over real well with his neighbors. They did not accept his offer, and as Nick observes, Americans who build this whole rags to riches sort of notion are not really interested in pretending like they are of a lower class than they are. That's not a fantasy they want to be involved in. So here again, Fitzgerald is bringing up this notion of it looks old, but it's really new, and I want to pretend like I have this sort of power, and there's this class dynamic that's going on that doesn't really exist either. And then he goes on to say that, the guy who built the house, he ended up dying, and within about 45 seconds, his kids sell his home. This aside gives, like I said, Fitzgerald that opportunity to make that commentary of reality versus fantasy. And Nick, to that end, also observes one of the servants in Gatsby's home opening up a window and spitting. That also represents what's going on behind closed doors. It may look all beautiful and well manicured and pretty, but that's gross, and that's not something that represents good manners and appropriate behavior and so forth. So the reality versus the fantasy is brought up again. Now the rain has stopped. So read into that symbolism as you will. And Nick goes back in very loudly so as to make sure that the two characters know that he's coming in. He doesn't want to surprise anybody, and he finds that Daisy is a little bit emotional, but that Gatsby, quote, literally glowed. At this point, Gatsby says, "Hey, I want to have you guys all over to my house. And Nick tries to resist, and yet again, just like in chapter 2, he's brought along with the couple sort of almost as if he's a chaperone. He's the one sort of giving these people permission to do things that maybe they shouldn't do. And as they're walking over, though, Gatsby is caught in a contradiction of what he has told Nick in the past versus the comment that he makes to Daisy when he says, hey, it's taken me only 3 years to get the money to buy this place. And Nick says, I thought you inherited it. And he's like, oh, I got it in a business. And so then Nick says, well, what business are you in? And Gatsby breaks his character for a second and is like, that's my business. And then realizing that's a totally inappropriate response to a perfectly legitimate question, he mentions that he's involved in the drug business and the oil business. And it's important to point out that what Gatsby means is that he was involved in pharmacies. And pharmacies are a perfectly legitimate front. However, when I say the word front, I mean that during Prohibition, a lot of times people who were running either manufacturing alcohol illegally without a liquor license, which would be bootlegging, or running alcohol sales through otherwise legitimate means, they would often utilize a pharmacy because A, it's a business that you can run your money through, and B, because there was a part of the law said that people could utilize certain alcohols for medicinal purposes. So there's an allusion there to the fact that Gatsby is involved in organized crime. Gatsby's house absolutely impresses Daisy, and I love how he watches her take everything in and absorbs and reevaluates everything as she reacts to it. I think it's also worth noting that among all the fancy schmancy rooms in Gatsby's home, his own living quarters, which are private and kept away from everybody else, is the most simple. And the most interesting thing that he's got available is this toilet set, which would be a tray and a comb and a brush and a mirror, all made of gold. See that color again. And Daisy just makes herself real comfortable right away since she sits down and just starts brushing her hair. And I think that's pretty symbolic since I don't go to people's houses that I haven't seen in 5 years and start using their hairbrushes on my hair. It's not really a thing. But in this scene where people are doing strange things, then we get to the part where Gatsby opens up his wardrobe, his closet essentially, and pulls out his clothes. And so I'm going to share that with you. He took out a pile of shirts and began throwing them one by one before us. Shirts of sheer linen and thick silk and fine flannel, which lost their folds as they fell and covered the table in many-colored disarray. While we admired, he brought more, and the soft, rich heat mounted higher. Shirts with stripes and scrolls, and plaids and coral and apple green, and lavender and faint orange with monograms of Indian blue. Suddenly, there was a strange sound. Daisy bent her head into the shirts and began to cry stormily. "They're such beautiful shirts," she sobbed, her voice muffled in the thick folds. "It makes me sad because I've never seen such beautiful shirts before." Now, as ridiculous as that scene may be if you're reading, especially if you're reading pretty quickly, I think it's really important to think about the life that Daisy lives. The confines of her marriage, the way that her husband treats her. And again, looking at the issue of time, 5 years ago, her parents didn't approve of Gatsby. Gatsby wasn't good enough. Gatsby didn't have the money and the means to equate to her social status. And here she is looking at all these beautiful things and these fine clothes that don't belong to her husband. Gatsby is not her husband. She doesn't have a life with him, but maybe this is a life that could have been. So as ridiculous as that scene is on first glance, it actually makes me pretty sympathetic toward Daisy. And I think that's part of the reason why Fitzgerald included that. And after exploring the gardens outside, Gatsby realizes his knowledge of the fact that Daisy's home is just across the bay, and that is when Nick astutely realizes that the light, at one time, which was probably a pretty enchanting symbol of Daisy, has probably lost some of its magic as she's sitting right beside him. And Fitzgerald is warning us with this observation by Nick. Can real people, three-dimensional, flawed people, live up to the fantasy that others create about them in their lives? And I think it's a dangerous expectation, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about fictional characters or real life. That is maybe not fair to put people in that position. And so be aware of that. Nick also inquires when they were inside about a photograph of a man named Dan Cody, and there's going to be a lot more about that in chapter 6, so I just want to make sure that you remember that Dan Cody was mentioned. And after an abrupt but revealing conversation, Daisy makes what feels like an asinine comment about pushing Gatsby around on some big puffy clouds. Fantasy alert, fantasy versus reality. Then they call out Clipspringer, that boarder, that moocher that's been running around doing absolutely nothing to contribute, and he's forced to sit down and sing some songs and play the piano, where he sings a song with some nice elitist lyrics about the class divide. And finally, before Nick, or while Nick is leaving, this is how the chapter concludes. As I watched him, he adjusted himself a little, visibly. His hand took hold of hers, and as she said something low in his ear, he turned toward her with a rush of emotion. I think that voice held him most with its fluctuating, feverish warmth because it couldn't be overdreamed. That voice was a deathless song, kind of like the sirens in the Odyssey. They had forgotten me, but Daisy glanced up and held out her hand. Gatsby didn't know me now at all. I looked once more at them, and they looked back at me, remotely, possessed by intense life. Then I went out of the room and down the marble steps into the rain, leaving them there together. So the rain is back. I hope that this has been a helpful guide for you, and this is just the beginning of this plot piece. So stay tuned with chapter 6.